This could be the most deadly year for migrants crossing the Mediterranean from North Africa into Europe. Why is it proving so hard to beat the people smugglers? This is Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore. For migrants attempting the crossing from North Africa to Europe, it is often their last hope of a better life. This year, Italy adopted a more aggressive approach to stemming the flow of migrants, backing the efforts of the Libyan coastguard. Well, some say NGOs' rescue boats are making the crisis worse, an accusation they say is nonsense. But how can this crisis be managed?
A complex crisis on land, tragically played out at sea. The desperate faces of a problem that has divided Europe, set adrift by unscrupulous traffickers. For many, it's a calculated risk for the shot at a better life. Their survival, their hopes, reliant on rescue missions just off the coast.
There is no connection between Libya and Rome in this matter. This is Libyan sovereignty.
But as states exert sovereignty, the EU tightens control, and aid agencies face accusations of facilitation. Are economic migrants leaving Libya losing their link to Europe and their lifeline? Since the peak of the crisis, NGOs have increasingly taken up the responsibility of search and rescue in the Mediterranean. They've prevented deaths and rescued thousands. But as the EU tries to stem the flow of economic migrants, the tide could now be turning against them. Accused by some of fueling the problem, strengthening the trafficking business by increasing the chances of success. And as Libya takes a wider role in patrolling its waters, tensions at sea are rising.
If you don't follow the orders, we will target you. I have already warned you before. Libyan government has warned you before, but you don't listen. It's your problem.
Backed by the EU, Libya's coastguard is turning away boats in a bid to deter traffickers.
We are seeing now the implementation of European policies who are using or supporting the Libyan authorities and supporting the Libyan coastguards with the only objective of keeping people in Libya.
Previous EU policies have had some success. There's been a dramatic reduction in the number of deaths of people trying to reach Greece from Turkey after a deal was struck in 2015. But the situation and the type of migrants in Libya is very different. The UN estimates that 7 out of 10 people trying to cross the Mediterranean from Libya are economic migrants. Power struggles have led to years of conflict and instability in Libya. Migrants held at detention centres on the coast have reported appalling conditions. There have been allegations of forced labour, beatings and rape. Desperation at sea. Images that have brought the crisis to the world's attention. For most, this crossing is the last hurdle into Europe. But there's a change of mood in the corridors of power there. And as the politics on the continent changes, the ramifications are being felt miles away across the seas in Libya.
Well, joining me at the round table from Geneva is the researcher and filmmaker Charles Heller. He has made European borders and migration the centrepiece for much of his work. The Libyan academic and leader of the Tagir party in Libya, Dr. Juma El-Gamati, he believes that the current EU policies towards migration will only destabilise his country further. Alan Mendoza is the founder and director of the Henry Jackson Society. He says the crisis threatens the very unity of the European Union. And Newsweek's Middle East reporter Callum Payton, he says that much of the anti-EU rhetoric on the continent can be attributed to the migrant crisis. Callum, we're going to come to you first. And a lot of that report was focused on the work of NGOs. The Italians have accused them of making it worse and possibly even colluding with people smugglers. The head of Frontex has said they're not working with them effectively and have also pointed the finger at them for making the crisis worse. How do you evaluate the NGOs in this crisis?
I think there is first of all a kind of a chicken and an egg situation here, saying that they've created the crisis or they're making it worse. The need for the NGOs is a symptom of the crisis. They need to go in there. They're rescuing people, but at the same time, certainly the smugglers are aware that they can leave boats in the Mediterranean and then have either EU military operations or NGOs pick up those boats. The smugglers really have no intention of doing any more than leaving migrants and refugees just waiting in the sea to be rescued. So in that sense, they are facilitating.
Charles Heller, what is your experience of the NGOs? Are they altruistic do-gooders, or are they actually looking to inflate their own reputation?
I mean, I think that what he just said here is very important. NGOs are a symptom of the situation. They are there because European states suspended the Mare Nostrum operation and refused to launch another proactive search and rescue operation following Mare Nostrum. So search and rescue NGOs are there because European states are refusing to do the work of rescue. Now, search and rescue NGOs, our data suggests, have made the crossing safer, right? Over 2016, the more search and rescue NGO vessels were deployed in the central Mediterranean, the safer the crossing was. They were actually responding to a situation that was made more dangerous by the European anti-smuggling operation Sophia, as well as by increasing intervention by the Libyan coastguard, and finally by changes in the smuggling business involving increasingly involving militias. Search and rescue NGOs responded to that situation and actually...
Of course, they're not the cause of the migration crisis. The migration crisis has many different causes, but the idea that NGOs are the cause of it are not the case. Have they found an opportunity? They've jumped onto something that exists. Obviously, there has been a move by Europeans to move away from the idea that we're going to rescue people, bring them into Europe. I think the question that's most interesting is, why do NGOs feel they should be rescuing people and bringing them into Europe rather than rescuing them and returning them from whence they came? That, to me, signifies they've got a very different agenda to necessarily...
There's a very simple answer to that, and that's international law. There's a very simple answer to that, and that's international law. Search and rescue is organized by international conventions concerning the laws of the sea, but also
NGOs are not part of this. It's a state issue, not an individual issue. Not an individual. If you want to go and be a search and rescue person, you can't say you're part of international law as a result of it. You can't.
Let's let Charles finish his point, Alan, and then take that.
An NGO which is deployed in the central Mediterranean is coordinated by the Italian Maritime Rescue and Coordination Center. Under international law, any vessel found in distress at sea must be rescued by any other vessel in vicinity. So the activities of search and rescue NGOs is framed by international maritime law on the one hand, but also framed by the Geneva Convention, which forbids sending back any person to a country where he or she might be at risk. And so
let's bring in Dr. Juma El Gamati. He's talking about the Geneva Convention preventing those rescuers from taking them to Libya. What are the problems in Libya that they would face?
Well, first of all, let me say at the start that this huge problem is not a Libyan problem. Libya has never been the cause of this problem. This is an international problem. It's unfortunate that Libya, because of geography and proximity, is used as a transit route. The reality is that the shores, the northern western shores of Libya are only 300 kilometers away from the island of Lampedusa, the Italian island. So this is the shortest crossing for
What's wrong with bringing them back to Libya? Why would that be against the Geneva Convention?
No, because Libya is unstable. It's going through a civil war. We have lots of problems. These are migrants who originate from sub-Saharan Africa. They're totally different to Libyan population, ethnically, culturally, religious-wise. So if they are settled in Libya, as some Western politicians advocate, I mean, one prime minister, I think Hungary prime minister said, let's build a gigantic refugee city in Libya. Let's use Libya as a buffer zone between the sub-Saharan African source and Europe. I mean, why should Libya be, I'm sorry to use the term, but this is a term used by United Nations High Commission refugee commentator, I think, or maybe a human rights commentator who said Libya is used as a dump for these.
But at the moment, it's actually a launching pad, if you like, for these illegal crossings.
Yes, it is, only because Libya is unstable. The southern borders with Chad and Niger, almost 1,200 to 1,400 kilometers, are unprotected. They are very permeable. Libya cannot protect those borders. And the international smuggling model, which is a huge operation, which starts at the source countries, in countries like Gambia, Liberia, Senegal, Nigeria. They actually recruit those migrants from their countries of origin, and they move them along until they reach the Libyan coastline.
We're going to come to that point in a moment, but would you accept that, Alan, that it's not safe to go back to Libya?
Well, I think, as always, I'm not suggesting one should just decant people randomly into random places. I think we have seen examples of international agreements that have been made between countries with regard to the migrant crisis. The most obvious one is the deal reached between the EU and Turkey, where there was a clear state-to-state deal. It wasn't that the EU said, we're going to stop people coming, you're going to just stay in Turkey. It was a deal worked out with the Turks. I'm not suggesting necessarily that Libya may be the answer. It could be Tunisia, it could be Morocco, it could be something else entirely.
But the
it
European...
cannot be beyond the wit and wisdom of man to come up with an idea where everyone can come up with a solution that works.
But the EU has been asking Libya to actually keep those migrants in centers where they can be processed, and if some of them, if they are eligible for asylum in Europe, then they'll be transferred. But we know that the overwhelming majority of them will not be eligible for asylum in Europe. So the temporary settling of them in Libya will become permanent, and Libya will pay for this process.
Callum, you were living in Libya for a year up to 2014. What's your experience of it?
Well, I mean, so what I would see when you would go down the streets is you would see migrants from sub-Saharan Africa on roadways, on roundabouts, and these most of them men who you would see going out for work. They would have been there for, you know, maybe a few weeks, but most of them as long as a year, and they are paying for their transit across the Mediterranean. From what I understand and from what people that I'm speaking to there now, that situation has got worse. But what also has become worse is as violence has increased and more people have become armed, because the proliferation of arms has continued in Libya. It hasn't ended. Migrants are much more likely to be kept in some kind of indentured servitude where they aren't paid, or if they are paid, that money will be regularly taken from them. So if we go back to some of the previous points, which were about, is it legal to take migrants back to Libya? There is also a moral or ethical question which is beyond that, which is if they're going back in, if NGOs are picking up migrants and then taking them back to Libya, where they will go into detention centres where torture and sexual abuse and indentured servitude or slavery are common occurrences, is that something that the EU states should be backing as policy?
And let me ask you just briefly, in your year there, talking to Africans who were waiting to make that crossing, did they ever tell you that they felt more inclined to make the crossing because they knew that NGOs or the European search and rescue missions would pick them up?
I mean, I have to say, actually, embarrassingly, that wasn't a question that I ever asked. Are you motivated to make this crossing because someone is going to pick you up? The story, perhaps from the Libyan angle, wasn't as large prior to 2015 when people started asking those questions. But what I would say is, for the people that I was speaking to, if they had made it to Tripoli, most of them were planning on making the crossing, and they were very well aware of the risks that they could die while they were doing it. They would say, we're willing to die for the chance of a better life. But equally, they expected to be picked up if they were there.
Can I just add, those migrants, when they were recruited from their countries of origin in sub-Saharan Africa, probably never intended to settle in Libya. Their eyes were on the dreamland, the promised land in Europe, okay? And they just use Libya as a route. So now they have three options. Either they are taken by Europe and given asylum or whatever, or they are returned to their country of origin, or they are kept in Libya. Now, the European Union have been arguing for them to be kept in Libya temporarily, but we know that temporarily will become permanent. So Libya will end up being the victim, will end up dealing with this problem. And that is where I come from. This is very unfair in Libya. Libya has got no job prospects. There is no economic growth. These migrants have nothing to do in Libya.
Can I ask you about what's changed in Libya this summer? It seems that the Libyans have stepped up their efforts to protect their own coast up to 12 nautical miles out.
Yes.
What's changed?
Well, I mean, there have been pressure from the Europeans, especially Italy. Italy has been pushing, pressurizing the government in Tripoli, the government of National Accord, to actually stem these migrants getting on boats and crossing to Italy. So yes, the Libyan Coast Guard have been much more active recently in trying to stopping them. You see, the Libyan Coast Guard is working against smugglers. Smugglers make a lot of money.
But they are themselves corrupt. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would so first of all, I would say the people that I speak to in Libya, whether they're in Sebha, whether they're in Sabrata, or and in the east as well, and in Tripoli, they will tell me that the black market in traffic and people smuggling is so endemic now that it's hard to find someone who isn't even tangentially involved. And I was speaking to someone this morning before I came on the program to say, how has the Italian training of the Coast Guard been going? And he says to me, this is a Tripoli resident, he just says, oh, this is the Libyan Coast Guard. Everyone knows that they're corrupt. And he says the only difference now in what has happened is they're picking up the migrants as they're going across. Nevertheless, they're still taking a cut from the smugglers. So he says what will happen now is the migrants will go to the smugglers, give their money. So these migrants who I think are routinely forgotten about in this discussion, who have been held in these detention centres and are paying money, spending months and months, often not getting paid, do eventually pay their money. And the first thing that happens to them is a cut of that money goes to the very same Coast Guard that will intercept them and take them back to Libya a few hours later.
This problem of migration probably started around the year 2000, 17 years ago. During the Gaddafi era regime, Gaddafi had a very firm grip on security in Libya. And the borders. And the borders. And yet he used migration as a manipulation tool to pressurize and blackmail almost the European Union, and especially Italy. Now, it's totally the opposite. Libya is unstable. There is no central government. There is no firm security institutions and no firm grip. So because of that, we have this fluid situation. However, part of a holistic solution is to help Libya stabilize, help find a strong central government which can easily rein in the smugglers. Again, I need to stress that the Libyan smugglers are only one link. One part of a very long chain. Only one link.
And the only reason, but it is one link, and the only reason we're discussing it is because, in a sense, we're looking at this discussion the wrong way around almost.
Exactly.
We're looking at it from the end point, which is, this is the final crossing, and that's the end point. Then we're looking at it where they're coming from, Libya. But you've just taken it a step back, which is, but Libya is unstable. We need to stabilise Libya, and then you need to take the step back beyond that and beyond that.
Charles, if I can just bring you in, because you're not around the table, you're at a slight disadvantage. Do you think it is being looked at the wrong way around? Whose responsibility would you say it is primarily?
I mean, I think I just want to respond a little bit to a few things that have just been said, and particularly emphasize that we've been seeing a dramatic escalation in the central Mediterranean over the summer. And what we've been seeing, on the one hand, again, is the criminalization of search and rescue NGOs, which were attacked using similar arguments initially as those that had been used against the Mare Nostrum operation back in 2014, that is, that it was constituting a pull factor. And precisely the ending of Mare Nostrum demonstrated how false this argument is. The ending of Mare Nostrum did not lead to less crossings, only to a dramatic escalation in the number of deaths. Mare Nostrum was ended in order to impose a deterrence effect onto migrants. And one part of the story is the attempt to reimpose deterrence by criminalizing search and rescue NGOs today. But the other part of the story is effectively that criminalizing search and rescue NGOs and limiting their activities is essentially the other side of the same coin of the policy of containment and externalization towards Libya. If
Charles.
the EU wants Libya to intercept more migrants as they leave the Libyan coast, it has to get rid of search and rescue NGOs and avoid that they rescue the migrants and bring them back to European soil.
Charles, just quickly, the operation that we haven't talked about, Operation Sophia, where European Union tries to intercept people smugglers and working with the Libyans to board those vessels and search those vessels. Do you have a problem with that operation?
Well, Operation Sophia, first of all, is founded on a very misleading rhetoric. It claimed that to save migrants' lives, it had to go after smuggling networks. Now, this is completely misleading in the sense that smuggling networks only exist because there is a demand for their service. And that demand for their service is only the product of the EU's policies of exclusion. Were migrants able to access safe and legal means to reach EU territory, smugglers would disappear within an instant.
Oh, well, let's pick up on that now. That takes us quite neatly to the possibility of solutions. Safe and legal channels for illegal crossings. What do you think?
Well, it's nonsense. Sorry, I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, I think, how can you have a safe and legal channel for something that's illegal? It doesn't make any sense. The point is...
Today, the only way to access asylum and request for asylum in the European Union is to cross the sea illegally. That's the only way.
Yes.
Is that the only way?
Well, to cross the sea illegally, potentially,
if you're looking... way to make
well, no, not necessarily, because you're making an asylum application if you're making an asylum application, you go to an embassy of the country in the place. Of course, well, it may not work, but that is a way of doing it. I think what the problem here we're facing, which is the usual discussion here, Charles, if I may, is that there's a division between refugees and migrants.
If you don't resettle migrants and refugees, they resettle themselves, and they resettle themselves by resorting to smugglers who put their lives at risk.
But this is
that's why we need safe and legal means for migrants and refugees to access EU territory.
Again, there's a key difference here between the two things. And I'm pleased you've taken up the distinction between migrants and refugees in this as well. A refugee, obviously, is someone fleeing from a certain situation which has made their life impossible to live. Now, that is a very different set of circumstances to a migrant who, I think someone around the table said, is looking for a better life, their chance of a better life. Economic migration. Yes. There is no legal right to economic migration, none. It is up to the country receiving migrants to determine what its migration policy is, and for others to try and get into it. It's not a legal right in that way. Asylum is different. That is something when you're fleeing...
That's absolutely right, that it's up for a country to determine who is the migrant.
One second, Charles.
If people have the right to claim asylum... If people have the right to claim asylum wherever they are, and then their asylum application should be considered, or their asylum aspiration should be considered. In this case, unfortunately, they want Libya to be the place or the center where these asylum applications are processed. And that is not fair on Libya. So the Europeans need to reconsider this policy. You see, we really need to have a holistic look at the smugglers model. The smugglers network starts from the countries of origin. They are recruiters, and they recruit these people and they pass them on from one place to another.
So
I'll give you one example.
You want to go to the country of origin and do what?
If they consider their asylum application from there, or they accept them. I'll give you one example. Recruiters from Gambia or Liberia or Nigeria or any place, they pass them on. For example, there is a city in the north of Niger called Agadez. In 2016, between February and September, IOM, International Organization for Migration, said 270,000 migrants passed through Agadez as a hub, where they are housed for a while until they are moved on along the chain until they reach the shores of Libya. This is a global, this is an international smugglers network. So it should not be blamed on Libya, and Libya should not.
The problem with the anti-smuggling logic and operations is very simply that every single anti-smuggling operation and policy only leads to more dangerous practices by smugglers.
Okay.
This has been the case.
Charles, I want to bring it back to Callum.
And it is today the case again in relation to Niger in particular. The crackdown on smugglers across the desert is leading them to use more dangerous routes.
Okay.
And this securitized approach to migration, which has been a failure over the last years, but even since a far longer time, since the beginning of the 19th, must lead us to adopt a completely different perspective.
Charles, I've got to bring it back to the table here, and a final point from Callum. We've talked about solutions. Going to the root of the problem, where would you see is the best place to put out the fire?
Well, that's a huge question, and if I had the answer, maybe I wouldn't be a reporter. I thought the Chadian leader at the Paris summit, where this deal was made, kind of really
Macron.
with Macron in Paris last month, really kind of struck at the heart of the question when he said, what we need to do in our own countries is we need to look at economics and we need to look at education, and this is about providing people with opportunities.
Callum, thank you so much. Callum Payton, Alan Mendoza, Charles Heller and Dr. Juma El Gamati. Thank you all for your contributions. I'm sorry we couldn't spend a little more time on it, but we have run out. Well, regardless of policy on either side of the Mediterranean, migrants will find a way to travel to Europe. The key is, can the EU find a way to manage the migration of people that works for all of those involved? You've been watching The Roundtable with me, Matthew Moore. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.